My name is Riley. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, practical, and low maintenance. I work hard, I plan carefully, and I don't raise my voice to be heard. If you met me once or twice, you might think I'm easy to overlook. If you knew me longer, you'd probably assume I'd always be there, handling things quietly, picking up what others drop, making life smoother for everyone else. I've learned that being underestimated often looks like being trusted. People lean on you. They assume you won't leave. They assume you won't look too closely at what's happening because you're not that kind of person. And for a long time, I let that assumption stand. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about screaming confrontations, public humiliation, or clever one-liners that win the room. It's about something slower and harder to notice. It's about what happens when someone realizes, too late, that calm doesn't mean unaware, and silence doesn't mean powerless. When I look back now, I can summarize the center of it with two sentences that still feel unreal when I say them out loud. I paid for the house my husband gave it to his lover. And beneath that, the quieter truth that took longer to accept, I funded a life that didn't include me. This isn't a story about a single betrayal. It's about a series of small decisions made by different people, all resting on the same assumption that I would keep absorbing, keep financing, keep forgiving, because that's who I had always been. It's also about the moment that assumption stopped being true. Not because I announced it, but because I acted on it. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I went from being essential and invisible at the same time to being absent in a way that finally mattered. You'll hear about the early years, when everything looked fair from the outside, the subtle shifts that didn't seem worth arguing over, the role I was quietly assigned without being asked, and the internal moment when I understood that staying silent didn't have to mean staying still. I'm telling this the way it actually happened, without embellishment, without villains twirling mustaches, without pretending I saw everything coming. I didn't. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized more than I'm proud of. I loved people who were already spending what they assumed would always be mine. What you won't hear is me asking for sympathy or cheering my own restraint. This is a documentary of emotional cause and effect, a record of what happens when one person does all the stabilizing and others quietly build their freedom on top of it. If you've ever felt useful but unseen, trusted but not considered, have you ever wondered what might change if you stopped explaining your silence and simply let it do its work? For a long time, I thought being dependable was the same thing as being loved. To my husband, I was the steady one, the planner, the person who remembered deadlines, tracked expenses, and smoothed over the rough edges of adult life so he could focus on what he called the bigger picture. He liked to say we were a team, but the unspoken rule was that my role was to make sure the team never felt any strain. If something broke, I fixed it. If something was late, I covered it. If something was uncomfortable, I absorbed it. To his family, I was so capable. That word came up a lot. Capable women don't need much, people assume. Capable women don't complain. Capable women can handle things. When holidays came around, I organized them. When someone needed help, I showed up with a solution, not a story. No one worried about me because I had never given them a reason to. At work, I was respected but rarely discussed. I did well financially, better than most people realized, but I didn't broadcast it. Money to me was stability, not status. I paid bills early. I saved aggressively. I invested carefully. I didn't talk about it because I didn't need applause for being responsible. I thought the quiet competence would speak for itself, and maybe it did, but not in the way I imagined. What I didn't see at the time was how easily reliability turns into background noise. When you always handle things, people stop seeing the effort. When you never threaten to leave, people stop imagining a future without you. I wasn't mistreated outright. That's important to say. There was no shouting, no cruelty that would make a clean story. There was something more subtle, an assumption that my presence was permanent and my contributions were automatic. I paid for most of the house because it made sense on paper. I earned more. I had better credit. We told ourselves it was just logistics, not power. The deed was a formality. The marriage was the real commitment. That's what I believed, and that belief shaped every decision that followed. When friends asked what I was like, my husband would smile and say, "Riley's just solid. She doesn't get worked up over things." It sounded like a compliment. I took it as one. I didn't realize that "doesn't get worked up" was slowly becoming "won't push back." I was the person others relied on to keep the emotional temperature low. If there was tension, I diffused it. If there was disappointment, I reframed it. I told myself this was maturity, emotional intelligence, the ability to see the bigger picture. What I didn't ask was why the bigger picture always required my silence. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being perceived as unshakable. People don't check in. They don't ask if you're tired. They assume you'll manage because you always have. I wore that assumption like armor, not realizing how heavy it had become. Looking back now, I can see how clearly my role was defined without anyone ever saying it out loud. I was the foundation, necessary, unseen, and only noticed if something went wrong. Foundations aren't consulted when people redecorate. They're just expected to hold. At the time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt trusted. I felt chosen. I felt like the adult in the room. It took years to understand that being needed is not the same as being considered, and that being calm all the time teaches people that you will tolerate more than you should. I didn't know yet that this version of me, the reliable one, the quiet one, the endlessly accommodating one, was the reason the next boundary would be crossed so easily. Because when people get used to standing on solid ground, they rarely look down to see what it's costing the ground to hold them up. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There's no sharp pain, no clear moment where you say, "This is where it changed." It slips in disguised as something reasonable, something forgettable, something you tell yourself isn't worth the energy it would take to question it. In my case, it arrived as a decision that had already been made. My husband mentioned it casually one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner. The tone was light, almost distracted. He said it the way people say things they assume won't be challenged. "I told her she could stay at the house for a while," he said. I remember pausing, my hands still wet over the sink, trying to place the pronoun. She could have meant a cousin, a friend, someone passing through. We had helped people before. I didn't feel alarmed, just slightly behind the conversation. "Who?" I asked. He glanced up, surprised by the question. "You know, from work." That was the first cut. Not the request, not even the situation. It was the assumption that my agreement was implied, that my home, largely paid for with my money, was something he could offer without discussion, without context, without asking how it might land with me. He explained quickly, filling in details I hadn't asked for. She was going through a rough patch. It was temporary. She needed stability. He said all the right words, the ones that frame generosity as urgency, the kind of story that makes hesitation feel selfish. I remember nodding, not because I fully agreed, but because I didn't want to seem unreasonable. I didn't want to be the kind of person who says no when someone else is struggling. I had built an identity around being the one who understood. Everyone else treated it like nothing. His co-workers praised his kindness. His family talked about what a good heart he had. No one looked at me when they said it. No one asked how I felt about sharing the space I had worked years to secure. I told myself it wasn't personal. I told myself it was just a logistical oversight. I told myself that marriage meant flexibility, compromise, trust. I filled the silence with explanations so I wouldn't have to sit with the discomfort. But something shifted quietly inside me that night. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that my role in the decision had been downgraded from partner to infrastructure. The house wasn't ours in the way I had believed. It was a resource he felt entitled to distribute. She arrived with suitcases and gratitude. She thanked him. She barely acknowledged me. Not rudely, just efficiently, the way you greet someone you assume is already fine. She took the guest room, then slowly, without discussion, the shared spaces. I noticed how my husband adjusted around her, how he explained things to her carefully, but summarized them to me, how he checked if she was comfortable while assuming that I always would be. It wasn't dramatic, it was incremental, easy to deny if you wanted to. And I wanted to, so I did what I had always done. I stayed composed. I told myself I was imagining things. I kept the peace. I reminded myself that this was temporary, that nothing fundamental had changed. But I remembered that moment at the sink. The decision had already been made before I was informed. The way my consent had been replaced with my compliance. That was the first time I understood something I didn't yet have words for. Boundaries aren't usually broken in one loud move. They're worn down by a series of quiet permissions you never meant to give. Everyone else forgot that moment as soon as it passed. I didn't. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. And that was the problem. Life continued in a way that made it easy to doubt myself. Mornings still arrived on time. Bills still got paid. Conversations still sounded polite on the surface. If I had been looking for proof that something was wrong, I wouldn't have found it in any single moment. What I found instead was repetition. Patterns don't feel dangerous when they arrive one at a time. She stayed longer than expected. A week became a month. A month became an unspoken assumption. No one revisited the arrangement because revisiting it would require acknowledging that it had crossed a line, and lines once blurred are easier to ignore than redraw. I noticed how my husband stopped asking and started informing, not just about her, but about everything. Plans, expenses, small changes to routines we used to discuss. Each time it was subtle enough to dismiss. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't angry, he was simply certain. Certain that I would adjust. Certain that I would understand. And I did understand. At least that's what I told myself. I rationalized constantly. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was being mature. Those relationships weren't about keeping score. I reminded myself of all the ways he was good, all the ways things could be worse. I focused on the absence of overt harm as proof that there was no real problem. But something else was happening underneath that logic. My discomfort was becoming inconvenient. When I hesitated, even slightly, it was met with confusion. "You're overthinking," he'd say gently. Or, "That's not what's happening." Not defensive, not aggressive, just dismissive enough to make me question my own perception. I started editing my reactions before they ever left my mouth. She began using the house as if it were hers. Not maliciously, just confidently. She rearranged the kitchen. She invited people over. She referred to it as home. No one corrected her. I noticed that when friends visited, she was introduced with warmth and context, while I was introduced by name alone, as if my role required no explanation. I kept waiting for the moment when someone would notice, where someone would pause and say, "Is this okay with you?" That moment never came. Instead, the expectation settled in quietly. I was the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who didn't make things awkward by naming what everyone else preferred to leave vague. And once a role is assigned, people start reacting badly when you step outside it. The few times I tried to speak up, it didn't go well. Not because anyone yelled at me, but because they looked surprised, almost disappointed, as if I were breaking character. The conversation would quickly pivot back to practicality, to timing, to how difficult things were for her. My feelings became a footnote, acknowledged just enough to be dismissed. So I stopped bringing them up. I learned to swallow reactions before they formed. I learned which thoughts would be met with patience and which would be treated as disruptions. I told myself that staying quiet was temporary, that I just needed to get through this phase. What I didn't realize was that every time I stayed silent, I was teaching them something. I was teaching them where the boundary wasn't. I was teaching them that access to my resources didn't require access to my consent. I was teaching them that I had a high tolerance threshold. Disrespect, when it's normalized, stops looking like harm and starts looking like routine. And routines are powerful. They settle into the body, they reshape expectations, they turn extraordinary behavior into background noise. By the time I noticed how far things had drifted, the question was no longer, why are they doing this? It was, why do they expect me to accept it? The uncomfortable answer was simple, because I always had. There's a moment, quiet, almost embarrassing, when you realize that the version of you everyone else is responding to isn't the one you think you're being. For me, that moment didn't come during an argument or a revelation. It came during an ordinary conversation where I suddenly understood that I was no longer being seen as a participant at all. I was being seen as a function. I was the stabilizer, the person who made everything possible without needing anything in return, the one who filled gaps, smoothed transitions, and absorbed inconvenience so others could move freely. It wasn't something anyone had formally asked of me. It was simply the role that had emerged because I was good at it, and because I never refused. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how decisions were made around me, not with me. How conversations would pause briefly when I entered a room, then resume without adjusting course. How plans were announced after they were finalized. My input wasn't required, just my compliance. I wasn't excluded. I was included by default, assumed, not invited. My husband spoke about our finances as if they were a shared pool he managed, even though the majority of it came from me. When I corrected a detail once, gently, he laughed it off and said, "You're better with numbers anyway. That's why we're good together." That sentence stayed with me, because being good with numbers had slowly turned into being responsible for everyone's safety net. Being emotionally steady had turned into being responsible for everyone's comfort. My strengths had been quietly converted into obligations, and I had let that happen because it felt easier than pushing back. The house was the clearest example. I had paid most of it. I handled the paperwork. I tracked the payments, but the language around it had shifted. It was no longer our home. It was something my husband felt authorized to allocate, a backdrop for other people's lives. I realized then that I had been cast as the reliable background character in my own story, the one who holds the scene together so others can have their arcs. There's a strange grief in that realization, not because anyone has taken something tangible yet, but because you understand how easily they would if it suited them. You see how replaceable your presence feels, as long as your contributions remain. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I was clear. Clear that this role wasn't temporary. Clear that no one was planning to reevaluate it. Clear that waiting to be seen was not a strategy. It was a hope, and a fragile one. I started to notice how often my needs were framed as optional, how often my boundaries were treated as flexible suggestions rather than limits. I noticed how much praise I received for being easy and how little consideration came with it. Being useful had made me invisible, and invisibility has a cost, not all at once. Slowly, it erodes your sense of authorship over your own life. You start reacting instead of choosing. You start accommodating instead of directing. You mistake endurance for virtue. That's when I understood something crucial. No one was going to take this role away from me, because it benefited everyone but me. If I wanted something different, I would have to step out of it myself. Not loudly, not dramatically, deliberately. The day everything shifted didn't look like a turning point from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no discovery that forced my hand. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet enough that I might have forgotten it if not for what changed inside me. I was sitting alone in the living room going through monthly expenses. This was routine for me. Numbers had always been a place where things made sense, where cause and effect were visible. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just doing what I always did, making sure everything held together. That's when I noticed it. A transfer I didn't recognize, not large enough to trigger alarms, not small enough to be meaningless. It was labeled vaguely, the way things are when no one expects to be questioned. I traced it back, then forward. Another one. Then another. Different dates. Same destination. I didn't feel panic. I felt something colder and steadier. I followed the pattern carefully, methodically. What I found wasn't catastrophic. It was worse than that. It was intentional. A slow, quiet redirection of shared resources. Not hidden well because it didn't need to be. It relied on the assumption that I wouldn't look too closely, or that if I did, I would rationalize it away. I sat there longer than I needed to, letting the information settle without reacting to it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call a friend. I didn't even write it down yet. I just let myself see it fully, without softening the edges. For the first time, I didn't rush to understand why. That was the shift. All the other moments, the house, the assumptions, the normalized dismissals, had trained me to look outward first, to contextualize, to excuse, to maintain equilibrium. But sitting there with those numbers, I realized something simple and irreversible. I was funding choices I hadn't agreed to. Not emotionally, not metaphorically, literally. And the quietest, most unsettling part was how calm I felt. No heartbreak, no shock, just clarity. The kind that arrives when the last doubt finally runs out of excuses. I understood then that nothing I said in that moment would change the outcome. Words would invite negotiation, promises, adjustments just sufficient enough to preserve the existing structure. I had seen that pattern already. What mattered wasn't being heard, it was being prepared. I closed my laptop and sat in the stillness, listening to the house around me. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like an asset I was underwriting for someone else's future. That's when I made a decision, not about leaving, not about confronting, not about consequences. I decided to stop explaining my awareness to people who benefited from my silence. From that point on, my quiet wasn't passive. It was chosen. I went about the rest of the day as usual, made dinner, asked neutral questions, listened more than I spoke. Nothing about my behavior signaled change, because I understood something important. The moment you announce a shift, you give others time to adapt. I wasn't ready to give that warning. That night, lying awake, I didn't replay conversations or imagine arguments. I made lists in my head. Not emotional ones, practical ones. Documents, timelines, ownership structures, patterns I needed to confirm before acting. I didn't feel angry, I felt awake. And once that happens, you don't go back to sleep. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been something I defaulted to, a reflex shaped by years of choosing harmony over friction. Now, it was deliberate, measured. No longer an absence of response, but a form of control. The people around me didn't notice the difference. That was the advantage. To them, I was still the same Riley, calm, reasonable, unbothered, the woman who didn't make scenes, the one who could be relied on to keep things steady. They mistook consistency for stasis. What they didn't see was how much more I was listening, not to respond, not to reassure, but to map. I paid attention to language, to timing, to what was said casually and what was avoided altogether. I noticed how often my husband spoke in assumptions rather than questions. How often were plans framed as facts? I stopped filling in gaps. When he explained decisions, I didn't correct or challenge him. I let him hear his own certainty out loud. When she talked about future plans that involved the house, I didn't interrupt. I let the shape of her expectations become visible without my interference. Silence has a way of inviting people to reveal themselves. When you stop managing their discomfort, they grow comfortable enough to be honest. I also stopped volunteering information. I used to narrate my thinking to make others feel included, to reassure them there were no surprises. I didn't do that anymore. I answered the questions that were asked. I didn't offer anything extra. That shift alone changed the balance more than I expected. I could see the faint confusion it caused. Not concern, confusion. as if a familiar appliance had started operating differently. Still functional, just unpredictable enough to notice. I didn't explain myself, because explanations invite debate. Instead, I observed how quickly people fill in silence with their own assumptions, how they project stability onto whatever doesn't actively resist them. They assumed I was fine because I looked the same. They assumed nothing had changed because nothing had been announced. And they continued behaving exactly as they had before. That confirmed what I needed to know. Behind the calm, I began organizing, not dramatically, not obsessively, just steadily. I gathered records, I reviewed timelines, I noted discrepancies without reacting to them. I learned which details mattered legally and which only felt important emotionally. I didn't rush. Urgency would have made me sloppy. Sloppiness would have cost me leverage. What surprised me most was how empowering it felt not to confront, to not rush toward closure or validation. I realized how often confrontation serves the other party more than it serves the truth. It gives them a chance to reshape the narrative, to reframe harm as misunderstanding. Silence denied them that. I could feel the old instinct flare sometimes, the desire to restore balance, to clear the air, to be seen as fair. Each time it did, I reminded myself that fairness without boundaries is just self-erasure with better manners. I wasn't disappearing, I was repositioning, and because no one noticed, I knew I had time. Time to be precise, time to be patient, time to make sure that when movement finally happened, it would be irreversible. Not because it was loud, but because it was correct. Silence, I learned, is only a weakness when it's accidental. When it's chosen, it becomes something else entirely. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something else was taking shape underneath. This was the part no one ever imagines when they think about quiet people. They assume silence means inaction, waiting, endurance. They don't imagine preparation because preparation doesn't announce itself. I didn't change my routines. That was intentional. I still paid bills on time, still showed up to work, still handled logistics. Stability is disarming. It convinces people that nothing needs their attention. As long as life feels manageable, no one asks who's managing it. What they never noticed was how I started separating observation from emotion. I stopped reacting to what things meant and focused on what they were: dates, amounts, ownership language, email phrasing, small details that tell you how people see their rights and responsibilities. I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal anymore. I already had clarity. I was building a record. I reviewed every major financial decision from the past few years, not with blame, just with accuracy. Who initiated it? Who benefited? Who carried the risk? Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped protecting anyone's feelings. I also started learning things I had never needed to learn before. Quietly, privately. I read about property law, about how assets are interpreted when the contribution and title don't align, about what documentation matters and what doesn't. I learned the difference between shared intent and shared ownership. None of it was dramatic, it was meticulous. At the same time, I paid attention to how my husband spoke about the future. His language had shifted. He used we less carefully. Sometimes it meant us. Sometimes it meant him and her. The difference was subtle, but consistent. He talked about long-term plans as if my role was assumed, but undefined. I didn't correct him. I wanted to hear how far his assumptions extended without resistance. She, on the other hand, was more open. She spoke about the house with certainty, about when we renovate or once things settle. There was no malice in it, just an entitlement that had never been challenged. She behaved like someone who believed stability had already been secured. And in a way, she was right. It just wasn't hers to secure. What they also didn't notice was how I began protecting my energy. I stopped overfunctioning emotionally. I didn't mediate tension that wasn't mine to resolve. I didn't smooth over the discomfort between them. I let small frictions exist without absorbing them. That alone revealed a lot. When I stopped compensating, they started noticing strain. Not enough to alarm them, just enough to irritate them. I saw how quickly my absence was felt once I stopped buffering. Still, no one asked me what had changed, because asking would require acknowledging that I had agency. Behind the scenes, I organized documents chronologically. I made copies and stored them securely. I kept records of payments, communications, and agreements, formal and informal. Not because I planned to punish anyone, but because I refused to be erased by convenience. I also took time to get emotionally neutral. That part was harder. Not because I was devastated, but because neutrality requires letting go of the desire to be understood. I had to accept that the story others told themselves about me, that I was fine, that I was steady, that I would adapt, was not something I could control. I could only control what I did with the facts. What they never noticed was how patient I had become. Not passive, patient. Patience isn't waiting for things to change. It's waiting until you are ready to change them in a way that can't be undone. And by the time I was ready, I didn't need their agreement anymore. The moment of real clarity didn't come with relief, it came with stillness. By the time I sat down with everything laid out in front of me, documents, timelines, payment histories, I wasn't hoping to discover something new. I was verifying what I already suspected. There's a difference between intuition and confirmation. One unsettles you, the other anchors you. What I discovered wasn't dramatic. No single explosive secret, no hidden account that changed everything overnight. What I found was something quieter and more decisive. Leverage. The house. Specifically, how it had been paid for, how it had been titled, and how casually everyone involved had treated those details, assuming fairness would simply exist because they believed in it. I didn't. I saw clearly that while we spoke about the home as a shared life, the financial reality told a different story. The majority of the payments, the down payment, the maintenance costs, all of it traced back to me. Not partially, predominantly, consistently. More importantly, the documentation reflected that. I realized then that the confidence my husband and his lover moved with was built on an assumption, not a safeguard. They assumed emotional bonds would protect practical outcomes. They assumed I would never assert a claim that disrupted their vision of the future. They assumed wrong. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt relieved, because relief comes when uncertainty ends. I also understood something else in that moment. Revealing this knowledge too early would neutralize it. If I announced what I knew, it would trigger defense, negotiation, and attempts to reframe. The story would become about intent and misunderstanding rather than fact. I didn't want a conversation. I wanted resolution, so I kept it private. That choice, to hold information without brandishing it, was one of the hardest parts. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I had been conditioned to share, to explain, to reassure. Keeping knowledge to myself felt almost unnatural. But power doesn't need to be declared to exist. I took time to consider my options. I could confront him immediately. I could demand changes. I could ask for recognition. Each option involved re-entering a dynamic where my needs were something to be negotiated down. I wasn't interested in negotiating my own erasure. The leverage I had wasn't just financial, it was temporal. I knew what I knew, and they didn't know that I knew. That asymmetry mattered. I also examined my own motives carefully. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I wanted to stop funding a life that didn't include me. That was the line. Once I named it that way, everything became simpler. I began preparing for the outcome rather than the confrontation. What did I want my life to look like afterward? What level of involvement was I willing to maintain? What was I prepared to let go of? Those questions grounded me. The reveal, I understood, didn't need to be emotional to be effective. It needed to be precise. It needed to arrive at the right moment, in the right form, without room for reinterpretation. So I waited, not out of fear, out of respect, for myself, and for the fact that some truths are most powerful when they arrive fully formed. Once you see clearly, not deciding is also a decision. I knew that if I did nothing, the outcome was already written. The longer I stayed silent without acting, the more entrenched their assumptions would become. Time in that scenario worked against me. Familiarity would harden into entitlement. My contributions would continue flowing outward, unnoticed and unacknowledged. But I also knew that rushing would cost me control. So I sat with the options longer than most people would. I listed them, not dramatically, not emotionally, just honestly. I could confront my husband privately, lay out what I knew, demand accountability. That path offered the comfort of immediacy. It also offered him a chance to reshape the story, to appeal to history, to promise adjustments that preserve the core imbalance. I could leave abruptly, remove myself from the situation without explanation. That would have felt decisive, but it would also leave loose ends, financial, legal, and emotional, that would follow me long after I walked away. Or I could do the thing that felt the least instinctive and the most irreversible. I could act first and speak later. That option required patience and restraint. It meant tolerating a temporary discomfort in exchange for a permanent correction. It meant accepting that I would not be understood in the moment and being okay with that. What made the choice clearer was recognizing that I had already been excluded from the future they were planning. My involvement was assumed only in terms of support, not authorship. I wasn't being consulted because I wasn't considered a variable. That's when I stopped thinking of the decision as leaving or staying. I reframed it as withdrawing consent. Consent isn't just about relationships, it's about participation, funding, endorsement, presence. I realized I had the right to withdraw all of it quietly, without explanation, until the reality matched the narrative. The irreversible option wasn't dramatic, it was structural. I chose to stop being the foundation. That decision didn't come with relief. It came with resolve. A calm, steady resolve that didn't need validation. I didn't announce it. I didn't mark the day. I just began aligning my actions with the truth I had already accepted. From that point on, every move I made was oriented towards separation, not emotionally, but practically. Clean lines, clear ownership, no ambiguity left for others to exploit. I also prepared myself for what would come after: confusion, pushback, attempts to restore the old equilibrium. I knew they would interpret my actions as sudden, even though nothing about them was. Change always looks abrupt to the people who weren't paying attention. What mattered to me was that when the moment came, when the consequences finally surfaced, I would be able to stand in them without needing to justify myself. I wasn't choosing punishment. I was choosing alignment. And once that choice was made, there was no benefit in waiting any longer. The most important changes I made were the ones no one could see. On the surface, life continued as it always had. I still woke up early, still went to work, still handled my responsibilities with the same quiet efficiency. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed I was a little less available, a little more contained, but no one was watching closely. That's the gift invisibility gives you at the end. No one monitors what they believe will never move. Behind that stillness, I began disentangling myself piece by piece. I separated accounts carefully, legally, without drama, not in a way that caused disruption, just enough to reassert boundaries that had never been properly drawn. I adjusted automatic payments. I redirected contributions that had long been treated as communal by default. I made sure every change was defensible, documented, and unremarkable on its own. Nothing I did looked like an attack. It looked like housekeeping. I consulted professionals quietly, asked questions without urgency. I didn't frame my situation as a crisis because it wasn't. It was a correction. That framing mattered. It kept the process clean, rational, and free of emotional distortion. I learned exactly what my rights were, and just as importantly, what my obligations were not. Each step reduced my exposure. Each adjustment narrowed the space where assumptions could survive. I didn't remove support all at once. That would have drawn attention. I removed it in ways that aligned with reality rather than habit. They didn't notice at first. Why would they? I had always managed things. They trusted that whatever needed handling would be handled. The illusion of continuity stayed intact because the impact lagged behind the action. That lag was intentional. I also began preparing for my own exit, not from the relationship immediately, but from the role I had played within it. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't voiced. I stopped cushioning outcomes. I let small inconveniences land where they belonged. The house felt different then, quieter, less managed. Not because I was neglecting it, but because I was no longer optimizing it for everyone else's comfort. Emotionally, I stayed neutral. I didn't withdraw affection pointedly. I didn't create distance as a statement. I simply stopped overextending. The difference was subtle enough to be missed, but real enough to matter. What I was doing wasn't secretive. It was sequencing. I knew that once the effects became visible, it would be too late to reverse the structure. Conversations could happen. Emotions could surface, but the foundation would already be reset. That was the point. The hardest part was resisting the urge to explain myself, to soften the landing, to prepare them emotionally for what was coming. But every time I considered it, I reminded myself they hadn't prepared me for anything. They had simply assumed, so I let them keep assuming. I wasn't disappearing. I was withdrawing my labor from a system that had learned to run on it without acknowledgement. And systems don't collapse when support is removed. They reveal who was actually holding them up. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when a system has been propped up quietly for a long time. At first, there was only confusion, small, disoriented moments where things didn't resolve themselves the way they used to. A bill was late, not catastrophically late, just late enough to be noticed. A repair took longer than expected because no one had scheduled it. An assumption went unmet, and there was no invisible hand stepping in to correct it. I watched all of this from a careful distance, not with satisfaction, with observation. My husband noticed first, but not consciously. His irritation surfaced before his understanding did. He seemed distracted, unsettled, as if the ground beneath him had shifted by a few inches and he couldn't tell why. He made comments, half jokes, half complaints, about things being off lately. I nodded. I listened. I didn't fill the gap. She noticed next. Her certainty started to fray around the edges. Plans she spoke about confidently now required follow-up. Things that had once just worked needed effort. She began asking questions, not to me, but around me, trying to locate the missing stabilizer without naming it. I recognized that pattern immediately. People don't miss you. They miss what you did for them. The house reflected it, too. Not dramatically, but honestly. The rhythm changed. Spaces felt less curated. Little tensions lingered instead of being smoothed over. Comfort required maintenance now, and no one had assigned themselves that role. That's when the subtle panic began. Not fear of loss yet, just discomfort. A sense that something reliable had stopped responding. They tried to correct it the only way they knew how, by increasing expectation. My husband asked, casually at first, if I'd noticed certain things slipping. He framed it as a shared concern. Team language. We need to get back on track. I didn't argue. I simply didn't resume. That's when irritation sharpened into unease. Because systems built on unspoken labor don't know how to ask for it back. They only know how to assume it will return. When it doesn't, the confusion turns inward. People start wondering who failed, without realizing they were relying on something they never earned. I could feel the shift in how I was looked at. Not accused, not blamed, studied, as if they were trying to determine whether this change was intentional. I didn't confirm or deny it. And because there had been no confrontation, no announcement, they couldn't position themselves against me. There was nothing to argue with, just a reality that felt less accommodating than before. Financial strain followed, slowly but unmistakably. Nothing dramatic enough to force immediate action, but enough to disrupt confidence. They adjusted spending, deferred plans, started revisiting conversations that had once felt settled. Still, no one asked me directly what was happening, because asking would mean acknowledging dependency. And dependency, once named, changes the power dynamic. I stayed calm, present, unreactive. I didn't withhold information if asked. I just didn't offer solutions that hadn't been requested. I let consequences find their proper owners. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative shifted internally for them. The story they told themselves began to change, from everything is fine to something is wrong, without ever including the missing piece, that what was wrong was the absence of my unpaid, unacknowledged labor. They felt lost before they understood its source, and that's when I knew the structure had already changed. Because once people experience the cost of your absence, even your partial absence, they can't unlearn it. They just wish they had noticed sooner. By the time they realized the change wasn't accidental, it was already too late to undo it. The first real attempt to fix things didn't look like accountability. It looked like nostalgia. My husband started referencing the past, how well we used to work together, how stable things had been. He spoke as if we had simply drifted and needed to realign, not as if something fundamental had been withdrawn. I listened. He suggested conversations, check-ins, resetting expectations. All the language of repair was offered only after the cost of my absence became uncomfortable. What he never said was, "I didn't see what I was asking of you." She reacted differently. Her panic surfaced more quickly, less polished. The future she had been planning began to wobble, and with it, her sense of security. She asked questions more directly now, about money, about timelines, about decisions that suddenly required clarity. Still, no one addressed the core issue, because addressing it would require admitting that the stability they had relied on was never guaranteed, that it came from me, and that they had treated it as ambient rather than intentional. I could see the regret forming, not remorse exactly, but calculation. The realization that they might have misjudged what was permanent and what was conditional. They tried to reinsert me into the system gently. Small gestures, softened tones, appreciation expressed just enough to suggest awareness, but not enough to name harm. It was the emotional equivalent of patching cracks instead of rebuilding the foundation. I didn't respond to the invitation. Not because I was punishing them, but because the invitation came too late. Repair requires recognition. Recognition requires honesty. What they wanted was restoration without reckoning. They wanted the benefits of my presence without the responsibility of having disregarded it. That door was closed. I could feel their confusion deepen as my calm remained intact. They expected anger, ultimatums, emotional volatility, something they could respond to, argue with, soothe. Instead, they got consistency. I didn't escalate. I didn't explain. I didn't backtrack. And that's when the fear appeared. Not fear of me, but fear of instability, of having to carry weight they had never trained for, of realizing that the future they envisioned depended on resources they no longer controlled. My husband asked me one evening, carefully, if everything was okay between us. I told him the truth. "I'm okay," I said. It was the most unsettling answer I could have given, because it made it clear that the problem wasn't my emotions. It was the structure. By then, any attempt to negotiate would have required undoing legal and financial realities that had already shifted. The moment for informal correction had passed. What remained were consequences. They felt blindsided. I wasn't. This wasn't sudden. It was simply the first time they were forced to feel the effects of decisions they had been making quietly for a long time. You can't fix a dynamic once the person who carried it has stepped out and locked the door behind them. You can only acknowledge that you should have noticed while the door was still open. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown like weapons, no raised voices echoing through the house. It unfolded the way most truths do when they can no longer be avoided, quietly, with a kind of stunned restraint. My husband asked to talk. Not urgently, carefully, the way people do when they sense they are already behind. We sat at the table where so many practical conversations had taken place before: budgets, schedules, repairs. It felt appropriate that this one would happen there too. This wasn't an emotional reckoning, it was an accounting. He spoke first. He said he felt distance. those things felt different, that he didn't understand when the shift had happened. I let him finish. Then I told him what I had stopped telling myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list every grievance. I didn't relive every moment of dismissal. I spoke in facts, not feelings, because facts were what could no longer be negotiated. I told him I had been making decisions I hadn't agreed to, that my role had shifted from partner to provider without my consent, that the house, the stability, the ease he had been offering others had been built largely on my labor, financial and emotional, and that I had withdrawn both. He tried briefly to reframe it, to explain intent, to say he hadn't meant to exclude me. I didn't argue with that. "I'm not talking about what you meant," I said. "I'm talking about what happened." That stopped him, because intent invites debate. Outcomes do not. She joined the conversation later, not by invitation, but by inevitability. By then, the structure was already exposed. There was nothing left to conceal. She asked questions that assumed there was still room to negotiate. There wasn't. I wasn't unkind. I wasn't cruel. I was precise. I explained what was changing and what had already changed. I didn't justify it. I didn't apologize for it. I simply stated it. What struck me was how quiet they became once they realized there was no emotional leverage left to pull. No anger to diffuse, no guilt to soothe. Calm is disarming when people expect chaos. They kept waiting for me to soften. I didn't. Not because I was hard, but because I was done. The conversation ended without resolution, not because nothing was decided, but because everything already had been. There was nothing left to persuade me of. No misunderstanding to clear up. Just a reality to accept. I walked away from that table feeling lighter than I expected, not victorious, unburdened, because confrontation doesn't always look like a clash. Sometimes it looks like clarity arriving in a room that has run out of excuses. And when that happens, the loudest thing is the silence that follows. What came after wasn't freedom in the dramatic sense. There were no cinematic exits, no sudden reinvention, no moment where I looked in the mirror and recognized a completely different woman staring back. Change, I learned, is quieter than when it's real. What I felt first was space, not physical space, though that came later, but internal space. The kind that appears when you're no longer bracing yourself, when you're no longer scanning conversations for what you'll need to manage, absorb, or smooth over next. I wasn't rebuilding myself, I was returning to myself. For the first time in years, my energy belonged to me by default. My time wasn't pre-allocated, my resources weren't spoken for before I even entered the room. I noticed how much lighter everyday decisions felt when they weren't carrying the weight of other people's expectations. I also noticed something else, how little anger I had. I had expected some rage delayed by years of restraint. It never came. What replaced it was discernment. A clear understanding of what I would and would not participate in again. I stopped confusing calm with compliance. I didn't become colder. I became more selective. My name is Riley. I'm in my late 30s. And for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, practical, and low maintenance. I work hard, I plan carefully, and I don't raise my voice to be heard. If you met me once or twice, you might think I'm easy to overlook. If you knew me longer, you'd probably assume I'd always be there, handling things quietly, picking up what others drop, making life smoother for everyone else. I've learned that being underestimated often looks like being trusted. People lean on you. They assume you won't leave. They assume you won't look too closely at what's happening because you're not that kind of person. And for a long time, I let that assumption stand. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about screaming confrontations, public humiliation, or clever one-liners that win the room. It's about something slower and harder to notice. It's about what happens when someone realizes, too late, that calm doesn't mean unaware, and silence doesn't mean powerless. When I look back now, I can summarize the center of it with two sentences that still feel unreal when I say them out loud. I paid for the house when my husband gave it to his lover, and beneath that, the quieter truth that took longer to accept, I funded a life that didn't include me. This isn't a story about a single betrayal. It's about a series of small decisions made by different people, all resting on the same assumption that I would keep absorbing, keep financing, keep forgiving, because that's who I had always been. It's also about the moment that assumption stopped being true, not because I announced it, but because I acted on it. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I went from being essential and invisible at the same time to being absent in a way that finally mattered. You'll hear about the early years, when everything looked fair from the outside, the subtle shifts that didn't seem worth arguing over, the role I was quietly assigned without being asked, and the internal moment when I understood that staying silent didn't have to mean staying still. I'm telling this the way it actually happened, without embellishment, without villains twirling mustaches, without pretending I saw everything coming. I didn't. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized more than I'm proud of. I loved people who were already spending what they assumed would always be mine. What you won't hear is me asking for sympathy or cheering my own restraint. This is a documentary of emotional cause and effect, a record of what happens when one person does all the stabilizing and others quietly build their freedom on top of it. If you've ever felt useful but unseen, trusted but not considered, have you ever wondered what might change if you stopped explaining your silence and simply let it do its work? For a long time, I thought being dependable was the same thing as being loved. To my husband, I was the steady one, the planner, the person who remembered deadlines, tracked expenses, and smoothed over the rough edges of adult life so he could focus on what he called the bigger picture. He liked to say we were a team, but the unspoken rule was that my role was to make sure the team never felt any strain. If something broke, I fixed it. If something was late, I covered it. If something was uncomfortable, I absorbed it. To his family, I was so capable. That word came up a lot. Capable women don't need much, people assume. Capable women don't complain. Capable women can handle things. When holidays came around, I organized them. When someone needed help, I showed up with a solution, not a story. No one worried about me because I had never given them a reason to. At work, I was respected but rarely discussed.